All right, let us do questions and answers. Please prefix it with the @ sign and my handle. I don't have a Q colon highlighter like Casey does. And, you know, I'll try to get to everything, but sometimes they pile up, so we'll see. Ginger Bill says he has big questions. That's fine. Said maybe I misread it, but why did the linker time go up for LLVM single threaded? Shouldn't the link time be independent of how LLVM ran? Ideally, that would be true. So like I said, we're not being too serious about the timing, but you know, there's just different stuff that happens in a system when you run things differently. So one thing might just be it legitimately takes longer to run the linker for some reason due to available physical memory or who knows, right? But I suspect it's more like, you know, to compile the LLVM thing in parallel, you actually have to break it up into like separate units, and you have to forego certain chances at optimization because you're doing things in parallel, right? So it's quite possible that more symbols are generated when we compile that way, and that might result in the increased link time. However, I don't actually know. I haven't measured, I haven't been curious enough to measure because we've just got more important things going on. You know, take all those numbers that I showed with at least a little bit of a grain of salt because they're going to be changing all the time anyway. But yeah, Q&A. All right. Have I heard of the NIM programming language? If so, what are my thoughts about it? It's got a module system, which I think I might be interested in taking a look at. I have seen that NIM exists. I've like scanned through the web page a while ago. It doesn't, you know, because it doesn't seem like exactly what I'm looking for, I didn't get too deep into looking at it. So I don't know the details of it. For example, I don't know how the module system works. So indeed, it might be interesting to look at. But yeah, I mean, my approach to these kind of things is a little bit piecemeal because there's so many languages out there, and a lot of them are doing minor variations on the same thing. So unless I get a recommendation from someone like, oh, this particular language is doing something really different, then there's not that much value add by spending a lot of time to study the nuances of a particular language and how it does its thing, right? Because it's not like you could like read the docs for a programming language and really understand it anyway. You have to like sit down and program in it for months at a minimum, if not years, right? So it's actually very hard to get a legit view of what it's like to use a language for real. So, you know, because my time is so limited right now because I have so much to do, I'm sort of saying, okay, I've got this past experience in my domain and I'm going to use that to shape what I'm doing going forward. And maybe I can be able to cherry pick good stuff from other languages, but it's not my job right now to be completely knowledgeable of what everyone else is doing, because to do that and to proceed in my own work would actually be very difficult, if not impossible. So yeah, so the result of that is I vaguely know about NIM, but I have never used it, and I don't know a lot of how it works. James Whitman asks, for libraries or procedures imported or loaded with different names, what do stack traces look like during a debug session when a stack trace starts in a procedure called by something imported by the main program? Okay, so that is actually a little bit arbitrary, you know, so the debugger, okay, a stock debugger, like say you're talking about GDB or Visual Studio, right? When it draws its stack walk printout, the names that are there come from one of two different places actually, right? If there's no debugging information whatsoever, that name may come from, you know, the exported symbol table in the object file or exe file or whatever, you know, whether it's cough or dwarf or whatnot, right? And then, of course, there may be debugging information. So actually, on Windows, you may have cough debugging information in the cough file. And actually, that's deprecated now. Use PDB, except maybe Visual Studio would look at that if it doesn't. Whatever. I mean, you know, and you know that. I mean, I know that James knows this anyway, but there's sort of a number of places where that can come from, right? So the answer to the question depends on some somewhat arbitrary choices. So first of all, if we don't generate debugging information, what do we put as the symbol name? There already has to be, well, let's clarify this. If you're actually exporting symbols to somebody else, or cross modules or something, then you sort of need some kind of name mangling or some kind of name modification because that format only accepts unique strings, I think. I mean, there's modifications that allow a version number, right? But I don't know if linkers do the right thing with that. I'm not educated enough on the historical behavior of linkers. You know what? I'm going to rat hole on this question way too much. So the answer is, it depends on the symbol being exported, and what that is a little bit of an arbitrary choice by the compiler, right? Because any particular file could be imported multiple times under multiple different names, then probably the default choice is to just use the local name in the local file, right? Because that's at least in some sense definitive, but it may be confusing, right, in some cases. So you might want to detect if it's only imported once under a specific modified name, then use that name. You may want to do that. I'm hoping that a source code view would make this unambiguous anyway, but in any case, getting smart about exported symbol names is not even something that I'm doing for regular symbols yet. Like to deal with name overloading and stuff, I'm just exporting with like, you know, a serial number after every name. So that's a thing that I'll come to later. Could we support spaces in identifiers? Why or why not? Well, that would change the grammar significantly, and it would outlaw certain grammatical constructions and require you to use more punctuation in other places. And spaces in identifiers is not really a problem that I have, so I'm not really looking to solve it. Like if the main point of this were a style upgrade, then I could see worrying about that, but I'm worried about way more things than style, so it's not on the table, spaces and identifiers. How do you share a single unshared import across files or modules? Well, the way you would do it right now is by, so if you did it the way that I showed in that demo where I prefixed each unshared import with a certain prefix, then you would just know that prefix and be able to reference it, right? So that exact demo that I showed would work spread across multiple files. That would be fine, right? Because I didn't file scope anything there. You could file scope it, and then it would be hard to get at, but I didn't. Someone's asking about C or C++ libraries. I already use C libraries. If you go look at previous demos, you'll see that. The foreign stuff that I showed at the beginning of this demo was about interfacing with, for example, C and C++ libraries. Someone's asking if instead of semantic whitespace, have you considered issuing compiler warnings if bad formatting has occurred or something like go format? I've thought about that, but I sort of feel like that might be something, I mean, maybe we'll provide a standard one of those in the standard library that you can call from a compile time metaprogram. That would be fine. I feel like that's something people are going to be very opinionated about, but you can make your own version of that, right? Now, it'd be a little bit, no, it wouldn't be that involved, honestly, because, you know, when you look at the syntax tree from the metaprogram, you get the line number and character numbers of the tokens, so you can see if things are inconsistently indented, I believe. You know, I've never tried that, so there might be one or two corner cases that you need to actually go back and look at the program text, like load up the text file, but you could do that too if you wanted to. But I feel like that's a user level thing, and my job is to make the user level ability to make checks like that as powerful and simple as and clean as possible. Someone's asking if we moved the whole company to Seattle. No, it's just me by myself. And then I go back to California once in a while. Someone's asking, is it possible to add types at runtime for something like dynamically loading modules or using the compiler VM for a REPL-ish experience? I don't like read-eval print loops. I think they're stupid. Sorry, but that's how I feel. When I was in college, we were taught Scheme as our first language, and we're like, oh, read-eval print loops are so awesome. But they only work if you're doing trivial operations, right? I mean, there's a time when I sort of use a read-eval print loop type thing, and that's when I'm in the debugger and I want to evaluate expressions. But that works even in C, right? So you don't, I don't know, there's a weird idea in the functional language community that it would be cool to like build software in a read-eval print loop incrementally by typing stuff, and like that's terrible. There's all sorts of logistical reasons why that is not a good idea. So I'm preemptively discriminated against read-eval print loops, first of all. I think it's good to be able to visualize what a program is doing, but I don't think you do that by printing values in a read-eval print loop. I think you do it with more sophisticated mechanisms of program visualization. When it comes to adding types at runtime, I mean, then you're talking about runtime JITting of code and stuff, which you could do if the compiler is a library, which it will be, and then you could dynamically link that via a DLL. That's fine. But the language isn't going to be built around that. The language is built around precompiled code where you know what the type of everything is. That's the focus. We're not going to defocus by thinking about all this rando stuff that makes software slow anyway. That said, if you want to do that, that's cool. And you'll be able to do it. You'll be able to, for example, have some text in your precompiled program, pass that to the compiler library, have the compiler library output a DLL that you then link by calling get proc address and whatever and calling into. Like that'll just work, but it's not sort of the main line of what we're doing. Any rough estimates on release date? No, sorry. Okay, Ginger Bill has a bunch of questions in a row. With regard to multiple instances of the same file with load and global state, isn't that just like an X macro-like operation? I use this a lot in C to implement numerous things like tag unions. and other metaprogramming stuff, so why limit it to files? Well, so in general, later there may be a module interface where you can give parameters to a module, and it's sort of a polymorphic thing that controls what's inside. Like, that might work. But I wanted this to be a very low-level operation that you don't have to think about. And this was the way to do it, you know, given the structure of what we have. So I'm not sure exactly what you're envisioning, because it's hard to tell from a couple of sentence Twitch question. But if you talk about stuff like C, I don't want to litter my C program with like insert macro prefix here in front of all my identifiers. I hate that stuff, right? I want my source to be clean so that when other people include it, yeah, I don't know. I mean, you could imagine simulating that kind of thing by like having a preprocessor that's like all of LLVM's parser, so that you can parse stuff and then only put prefixes on identifiers that you want. But like, man, that's ugly, and you still need to like change the file. I don't know. It's just, I don't want to go that way. It's a lot of machinery to do a simple thing. Okay, second question. From Ginger Bill, because your static if is allowed at file scope, I'm guessing you do not allow cyclic imports. That's not correct. Cyclic imports are allowed and handled just fine. However, if you do you realize this causes a semantic graph that is impossible to check in many cases? No, it's not impossible to check. You'll have to give me an example of something that is supposedly impossible, because as far as I know, the only things that are impossible to check are things that are legitimately nonsensical, like if structs include structs so that they would blow up without bound to be an infinite size or whatever. That's uncheckable, because it doesn't make sense as a data structure. But as far as I know, everything that makes sense is checkable. But I could be wrong. So if you want to tell me an example of how it's broken, if that example is correct, then I would actually be very grateful, because then I would have a new problem to solve. So you're saying, how is ABC underscore thing better than ABC dot thing? You say it's dereferencing, but you already have something similar, blah, blah, blah. Well, because I can make my prefix very, very short if I want, for example, it could be one letter, and it just feels lower friction to do that, right? I mean, some things are not logical, but when I think about dereferencing namespaces to get at stuff, it's like more work, you know, in my brain, and I don't feel as good about it, right? I do that for stuff that I reference less often, but yeah, I mean, you know, so first of all, it's easy to make very short prefixes with this string prefixing thing, like 1 or 2 characters. If your default, I mean, I suppose you could import a module with a 1-character name, but you still got the dot, which is a significant overhead when things are that short. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe it's not that different. Like I said, we're going to have the ability to put stuff into a named namespace later anyway, because you just want that. So maybe it just becomes an individual programmer style thing, which way you want to do it, and I'm fine with that. It's just I wanted to, like the prefixing thing that I showed, was more about like, look, you don't need to have a culture of having to prefix your own code when you write it so that other people can use it, right? Like, because they can do that if they want to, or they can put it in a namespace or whatever. Like, I'm not so worried about how the namespacing happens. Again, it's just my job to make sure it can happen, right? And so prefixing is one way, putting into a sub namespace is another way. feel like there's something else about that that I wanted to say that I forgot. I don't know what it is. Maybe I'll remember later. Someone would like to know my opinion about AutoVizification in data structures, and will you include some kind of support in the language? I do not know what that is. I don't believe I've ever heard the word AutoVizification. So if you can tell me what it is, and maybe refine the question, then I can answer it. Maybe I have heard that and just forgot. That's possible too. Maybe I spilled water all over the floor. That's definitely possible. Okay. When loading source files with sharing off, is it possible to specify externals, globals differently for each version? Like one version with Windows true and another with Windows false. Right now, with the mechanisms that I showed, I'm not thinking of a good way to do it. But, like I said, I want to have some kind of mechanism for module parameters at some point. And so once that gets added, so if you had module parameters, for example, then remember that math library where there are two versions of everything, one for float and one for double? You could give a parameter when you load it of like, I want the floats or the doubles or both, right? And there could even be a default value of include both so that you don't worry about it. And so I think that kind of thing is how you would do it. And, you know, provided that the library author thought about the fact that you might not want both routines of everything, he can put that module parameter in there and then have his code work with it, right? The reason I showed the renaming thing is because that works regardless of what the author of the code thought about, right? So when you're talking about specifying external globals differently, so that's an interesting middle case where you could imagine setting something up where you're just like, yeah, reroute the scopes of these to these three different scopes that have different declarations for some variable. That sounds like a sophisticated enough operation to me that you would want to do it from a compile time metaprogram maybe anyway. And I haven't thought about that yet. But that's interesting. We might enable that if it makes sense. Yeah. But and it's possible, you know, oftentimes people will ask me a question like, how do you do this given what's there now? And I'll say, I don't know. And then the stream's over and I'm like, oh, obviously, blah. So there might be a way to do it with what I showed or even prior to today, right? I mean, you can always go back to preprocessor level and like start with a string and, or just load the file as a string and then preprocess it and do it that way. But I prefer, I assume we're asking about something more sane. So I'm not thinking of something right this second, but there might be a way to do it. Concerning use of external libraries, is there a volatile keyword? If you pass a pointer to an external library, it is often necessary to be safe and prepare for changes at that memory location which cannot be inferred by the compiler. Well, I mean, if your compiler actually works and somebody took the address of your variable and passed it to a library that you can't see, then your compiler shouldn't be assuming anything about what's in that value thenceforth, right? I mean, unless you're specifically talking about a threading kind of situation. In which case, you know, there will be keywords for dealing with that or annotations that go in variables. I don't think they will correspond directly to C and C++. So it won't be like exactly like volatile and restrict and whatever. There will be some equivalents of that kind of thing, though, yeah. They're just not in yet because it's further down the road of features than where I am right now. Someone's saying, what about multiple precompiled libs exporting the same symbol but loaded with different prefixes? Won't that cause linker errors? Well, if you're using this traditional C toolchain, yes. Because they would have the same name in the precompiled library and because the linker just piles that stuff together. However, if we wrote the linker or just did our own linking, which is more likely without the concept of a linker, we wouldn't have that ambiguity in the first place. I mean, my preference is not even to have a machine code format that you're using usually. Like if you want to distribute a format that's, obfuscated like machine code, but still compilable, that's better because then you can do all this polymorphism and cool stuff on it, right? Once something is in a precompiled library, it's kind of dead. It's like not malleable anymore. So I want to get away from dead code like that. So, but provided that you have to deal with dead code like that, unless we wrote our own actual linker that interacts with legacy formats, then probably you would have that problem, yes. Unless, the other way to get around it is to load all your libraries as a DLL and then at link time for the you don't use like the Windows automatic DLL linking at startup. You like add a preamble to your program that loads each dynamic library and cross-references the names to the right names, and in that case you could get rid of the naming conflict. And instead of the DLLs being like loose files on the disk, you could actually pack them into the executable, right, as just extra data, and then load them at runtime from memory instead of a file, right? So, and for all I know, that might even be the standard way that we interface with libraries because it solves so many problems. Like I want to get away from the crappiness and slowness of the traditional linker because it's so bad, it's crazy. And that may be the way to do it. I just haven't gone far enough down that road to predict. I've missed some quotes scrolling back up. Does the foreign system library do demangling, or does it require some kind of function definition file? Right now, we do not try to duplicate name mangling. I am not sure what the right way is going to be to do that. If you want to interface with C++ libraries compiled with Visual Studio or whatever, right now we just interface with stuff declared as extern C, so it doesn't have mangling. Later on we'll deal with that. Someone's asking, what's my definition of good programmer? I feel like I've answered that before. Does anyone want to try and dig up a link? Because I don't want to just be repetitive about the same topics all the time. Someone is asking, hello, do you think you could implement ways to understand underlying CPU memory behavior, such as the stack and CPU cache and whatnot? Languages like C++ don't model these explicitly, and it requires some knowledge, like shouldn't code arrays like this on this platform? I don't feel like that's part of the problem that I'm trying to solve. Because in the kind of domain that I'm targeting, people expect for highest performance that they're going to write specific code for specific platforms. Hopefully it's not the majority of your code, right? Hopefully it's a small piece of your code that nevertheless matters a lot for performance, right? So your inner loops and your most critical procedures or whatnot, you may customize for different platforms, which is why, for example, I showed the static if today and some of these other features. I am not taking the C++ view that you should only live up on a high level and only write C++, and then everything below that level magically happens. I've never seen that actually work in the real world. Ignoring the fact that there's a real mechanical computer running your program and that it's made in a specific way that may be different from a different real mechanical computer, ignoring that fact always seems to result in sadness. And so I'm rather taking that as a given and then letting you, work with it rather than against it. So trying to have the language understand a great deal of platform-specific things, I think, is not necessarily that good of an idea if you're trying to wrap them or something. Now, if you're not trying to wrap them, like if you're just giving the programmer power to do stuff, that's great. So like inline assembly, great, access whatever system things that you want that are particular to a system is great. But we're not going to like invent abstractions that try to wrap all this stuff. That's weird and unnecessary and unhelpful, I think. What do I think about Clojure? Have I seen any Rich Hickey talks about programming language? Kind of like Nim, I have a surface level understanding of Clojure. My idea is that it's a newer dialect of Lisp that has static type checking, right? And that runs in the JVM or something, right? That's all fine, but I don't want to use a garbage collected language. I don't want to use a Lisp-like language. I do think it's good that static type checking is there. I think that's cool. But I would not program in Lisp, so it's sort of out of the domain of what I'm really interested in. I've done more than enough Lisp, in college and the years right after college that I don't want to do anymore. Well, and when trying to edit my frickin' Emacs config file, God. Someone's asking, is there a forum to discuss debatable questions or whatever? Not really. You could go to the Handmade Hero forums and start a posting there. That would probably be the closest approximation. Or, sorry, not Handmade Hero, but the handmade.network site has forums, and you could start a forum about this. I'm not going to debate anybody about these topics because I'm much more interested in focusing on building the language. But if you guys want to argue about stuff, that's fine. Refinement of the single unshared import question. If two different files do an unshared import with the same prefix, is that an ambiguity error? Hold on, I'm going to turn on a light because it's getting dark in here. So this is something I thought about a little bit, and what I decided, at least as the interim result, is that what'll happen in that case is that you'll just get redeclared identifiers. Because the thing is, for simple cases, you could look in the code and say like, oh, it's the same prefix or function, so we've already done this work and we're not going to duplicate it, right? So we've already done this import, right? But you could have the same procedure text get compiled twice, or you could have two different implementations of the same procedure with the same results, and so like you start getting into like halting problem territory almost of like determining if these two things are the same program and if you should rerun it or not. So that's not the business I should be in. So basically, if you remap names, that is always going to get run, well, ignoring all the static if stuff that'll cause things not to get run, right? If you remap names, that remapping will happen, right? So if you remap names twice to the same names, you'll get redeclared identifiers. So if you wanted to do that, either you would do that in file scope. So for example, if I want to prefix all my widgets with like WL. But I only want to do that for this file because I don't know what the rest of the program is doing. I can do that at file scope and it won't interfere with anyone, right? I should have demoed that, but I didn't. Demo was already long enough, I guess. Or just coordinate your program and know that you're already importing once and don't import it again, right? Those are sort of the two solutions right now. Whether that's a good enough answer in the long term, I think we have to see. If a real problem arises with the way that this stuff works, then we'll look at ways to solve it. But as always, I'm not going to get too anxious about things that are not known to be real problems yet. Someone's asking, what am I planning on working on next in the language? Actually, I'm going to be working on the game code more. In fact, I have been for the past couple days. Because I want to build that into a more and more complex game so that I have a real thing against which to test the language, right? So I predict at least a solid month of working on game stuff before I do more major language features. Tim's asking, for something like your OpenGL wrapper, would you stick with the GL prefixes or would you remove them and switch it to the import prefix? For something like GL that is the same everywhere, I think it probably just annoys people if you remove the prefix. But maybe not. Maybe it's fine. I mean, maybe we should remove the prefix. I don't know. The thing about GL is that the prefix is inconsistent a little bit, right? So for procedures, it's lowercase g, lowercase l, but for all capitalized constants and stuff, it's capital G, capital L. So, you know, your procedure would have to be non-trivial. Your remapping procedure would have to, as we talked about was a possibility, you'd have to like look at the type of what the thing is, or else guess based on the name whether you should prefix it or not. And that's a little bit goofy. And in fact, aren't the constants capital G, capital L underscore? So like that's super inconsistent. Anyway, I don't know. I'm really thinking about the future here. But I did consider, when I first did that file for GL mappings, I did consider omitting the prefix, but nah. Do I think adding prefixes makes things like autocomplete and jump to definition more difficult to implement in editors? Probably not, because I don't think autocomplete should be super dumb. Like, I think it should match on the middle of a word just fine, you know? So like say you're using OpenGL and you want to run GL vertex, you should just be able to type vert and autocomplete that, right? And maybe even the auto-completion, you know, if it knows that you like camel case or something, it'll use camel case as the delimiters for words, or maybe not. I don't know what the best heuristic is, but I don't think that the model of autocomplete of starting only at the beginning of the word is very useful, because lots of times, you know, even if you're not talking about prefixes, lots of times you might have procedures. Like if you're describing what you're doing, like serialize underscore float, and then serialize underscore vector, and then serial blah, blah, blah. If you have to type out the serialize underscore the whole time anyway, that's not a very good autocomplete. So I don't think prefixing is a problem, or it's not any different of a problem than you already had. So James is saying he was asking about stack traces, about the integrated debugger. Yeah, so I didn't actually, you know, I started that by saying in stock debuggers, blah, 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 and then felt like I was rambling. I feel like the right model for debuggers is actually not the current model where everybody in the world tries to shoehorn their output into a very specific format, because that has, you see what that's led to. It's not a very good world. Like, hardly anyone outputs debugging information, right? Like people resort to, I'm using LLVM or GCC or something, and I go through that to make debugging information. Very few people generate it a priori, right? Whereas I feel like you would have a lot more freedom and it would be much easier to write code if you could just generate your own file and then write a plugin for the debugger, right? So that's kind of what I would prefer, is a debugger that takes plugins that understand arbitrary formats. Sort of like a text editor would, right? Because if you're in a text editor, yeah, I don't know. That's again a rat hole, but I would like a debugger that let me feed it something besides a cough or dwarf or PDB. And I don't have that option right now. Someone sent me a link to AutoVizification, which I will read later. Yeah, I don't know. Someone else is asking in more detail about when the language will be available. I don't exactly know. You know, I want it to be good and solid and not waste people's time. Just today in doing new stuff on the game, or the past couple days, I found like 5 bugs that are different degrees of non-trivial and scary, and that I would have sworn weren't there, right? Because I've written enough test code and all these demos that I do and stuff, but stuff sneaks in under the radar, and any one of these bugs could drive people crazy for hours, right? And if I released it en masse, one of these bugs could drive 100 people crazy for 10 hours each before they figure out what's going on, and that's 1,000 wasted hours. That's like an ecological disaster, right? So I don't want to do that. I want things to be at least relatively solid, but I'm not going to be perfectionist about it either, right? We're going to go to a small circle of early adopters first and then widen it out. It's just I don't know exactly when that will be. We'll see. Off-topic question: does the exponential increase in indie games released on Steam concern you in any way? Yeah, it concerns everybody, because it's harder to make money off your game, which means it's harder to make a living as an indie game developer. That's true for me, as it is for anybody else. And it's a hard situation, but it's not as hard as on iOS, where good luck getting anybody to notice your game. So it could get a lot worse, and I hope it doesn't. Have I gotten to think about thread features in this language? Not yet. Not seriously. I've been thinking in the background about it, in a background thread, but not seriously enough. And I'm not sure that there are good thread features. You know, aside from, you know, maybe like thread sanitizer or something. And good support for, you know, good support for interfacing with the CPU about threading, right? I don't know though. We'll see. Are there variably sized arrays on the stack yet? There are not yet, no. That'll happen eventually, because it's good. It's very, you know, if you know you can put something on the stack, it's very good to be able to, because it's very fast. So that'll happen. It's just, it's on the list somewhere, right? Yeah, so someone's saying closure by itself is not that interesting, but the philosophy is quite cool. Keep it simple, JSON, less is more, etc. I don't think JSON is a very good file format. Sorry. There are many better file formats for equivalent things. However, let me say something about the keep it simple thing. So there's all sorts of principles that you hear in language design, like keep your language simple, make it orthogonal, use orthogonality to reach out to the most stuff and all that. And like, that's true to an extent, but I think most languages designs that use that as a philosophy take it too far and actually then make my life hard. Like a practitioner who's very skilled at using tools cares about the nuance in tools, right? So if I'm like a worker dude who's got my toolbox and I'm gonna go, you know, work on some mechanical stuff, I don't have one screwdriver and one saw and, you know, one like caulk tube, right? I've got many screwdrivers of different sizes depending on how much torque I need and how much finesse I need to turn that screw, right? I have a hacksaw for certain kinds of things, and I've got a bigger, heavier saw, right? And then I've got the super sawzall in my truck if I have something really serious I need to do, right? And I've got little super glue, and then I've got like caulk for pipes, and I've got different things. So orthogonality, when you are trying to do a good job and you're an expert who knows his tools, orthogonality is not really a concern for you because you're intimately familiar with your tools, right? So I'm trying to build a programming language that people are going to use daily for decades, right, if it succeeds. I've certainly used C++ daily for decades and suffered tremendously at times from that. So orthogonality is not, so I think orthogonality and keeping your language simple is nice and is a good principle to have, otherwise you end up with Perl or something, right? But that's the first step. So the first step is you go out in orthogonal directions and get as far as you can with simplicity, but then you fill in the space actually and make it more complex because those complexities ease the friction. It gives you more ability for finesse. It gives you the ability to pick up this size screwdriver instead of that one, right? If I have to try to turn every screw with a tiny screwdriver, I'm going to hurt my hand, right? If I have to turn every screw with a big screwdriver, then it won't fit in the, you know, like I won't be able to fit it in the aperture that I have for turning the screw. Short and long screwdriver, there's at least 2 dimensions, and then there's like, you know, Phillips versus flathead versus funky star thing. Like there's, you know, it's just, it's not that simple in the real world. And so on the one hand, there is something to keeping it simple and orthogonality and all that good stuff. But if you stop there, then you're gimping your language, actually. And that's important, right? There's reasons why C++ is used by a lot of people, and those reasons are not simplicity or orthogonality, right? So, yeah. Someone's asking, would I be interested in a volunteer? There's already someone who's being paid full-time to work on it, and my ability to coordinate is maxed out right now, so I'm really not looking for volunteer kind of efforts. But who knows, that may change in the future once we go to a more limited release kind of a thing. So someone's asking, to clarify, do I see it as part of the standard library to find facts about the hardware, things like memory free size, CPU, cache line size, SSE instruction set checks? You know, like I might try to provide some useful routines to do stuff like that that are in the standard library, right? That you can call if they're there and whatever, and you don't have to learn the platform specific thing. For example, if you want to know how many physical cores does this machine have, right? There's probably a standard library function that tells you that answer. However, I'm not going to be trying to build an abstraction where you never find anything out about the hardware except through the standard library. I think that's a mistake, right? So there's going to be some things that aren't even a concept on some platforms but are on other platforms, and so maybe that's not even in the standard library. Maybe you just go fully down to platform specific code in those cases, and that is totally fine. Wow, okay, I'm down to the bottom of the thing and there's no more questions, and I've been talking for hours. So thank you everybody for showing up, and this will be on YouTube if you missed it. I'm not sure when the next demo will be. Like I said, I'm going to be working on the game for a while. But thanks for coming by, and I might do some gaming tonight, or who knows. I don't know, I've talked so much, gaming might be a different day. We'll see. Good night, good afternoon, good evening, all that good stuff.